Alright guys, so today I thought I'd have a little talk. I know it could be a little bit risky this, but I thought I'd have a little bit of a talk about the smart telescope, the ZWO Seestar, which is a smart telescope. Now, there are a bunch of videos out there which are, I think in general it's fair to say that most of the footage that I've seen and most of the YouTube coverage of the Seestar is overwhelmingly quite positive. I have seen a couple of videos which are not quite so impressed with it as a product. I did watch a video, I think I watched a video maybe last week by Ed Ting, who has a really good channel. And yeah, I was quite surprised because for the most part, most of what Ed said in that video, I found myself agreeing with. But I was also quite surprised the sort of the backlash he got in terms of people were really upset about his opinion, basically that he didn't think it was that good, the ZWO Seestar yet. And he sort of advised caution around the product and basically waiting. His main advice was that he thought people should wait around the ZWO Seestar and that the product's not mature enough yet. And there's probably going to be a lot of iterations, so the technology will become redundant. So certainly for like sort of beginners, I think it's I find myself agreeing with Ed. Now, I don't have a ZWO Seestar, but I have seen many of the pictures out there. So yeah, I'll just say that first. I don't have the product, and I personally wouldn't buy the product because, for me personally, I'm looking for good quality astrophotography images. If I'm doing imaging, that's what I'm after. So that product, it doesn't appeal to me as a product, but it's also not designed to appeal to people who are probably like me, who are already doing astrophotography and have invested in a rig that's, probably worth a fair bit of money. It's probably designed, I think it's fair to say that it's designed for a beginner who maybe wants to, they may be a bit intimidated. They're not sure if they want to take images of the night sky yet because it can be costly and it's a bit intimidating, and maybe they've done a bit of research and it looks quite complicated. And for sure, if you're going to go into astrophotography, there's no doubt that to get good quality images, it is an expensive hobby, and there is a certain amount of complexity and learning that has to happen if you're going to go into astrophotography. So, I think it's probably fair to say that here in Australia, if you were looking at getting yourself an astrophotography rig, even if you went for a fairly modest rig to start with, like a little Newtonian on a mount and a camera, you'd probably still be talking about $2,500 to $3,000. Maybe a little bit cheaper than that if you can get secondhand, which you often can. But my point is that it can be expensive and it can be a bit complicated. However, putting myself in the shoes of what I would recommend to a beginner, very much like I found a few months ago when I had a quick look at the Dwarf Labs little smart telescope system, I still wouldn't be recommending the Seestar to somebody. So the Seestar here in Australia comes in at $900 Australian. I think it's about $500 in the US. But for me, I've tried to at least sort of put some of this down, put some of my thoughts down here. So I've sort of put my Seestar thoughts on the left, put my other options here down on the right, just to try and flesh out some of my thoughts here. And the problem for me with the Seestar, even as a beginner, the main problem that I see is that it doesn't really do any particularly one job well for me. So in terms of images, like the image quality isn't there. So you can, because of the design of the system, it's an alt-az system, so you can only take relatively short exposures for astrophotography, maybe 10, I don't know, maybe as many as 20 seconds. So you're never going to get the best images out of it. And I guess at the other end of the scale, I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe you could put a, what about with an eyepiece? And of course, you can't put an eyepiece in it either, because it's a closed system and it's meant for just taking images with. So from that point of view, the Seestar system, it's really designed for EAA, which is electronically assisted astronomy. So it's like, it's a point and click system. You can tell the Seestar where you want it to go. It's going to go to that part of the sky and it's going to take a series of images. So obviously you're going to see more on your screen than you could see with your eye, because it's gathering more light. Of course, it's a little 50mm refractor. So it's obviously going to gather more information than your eye could. And then it's going to stack those images for you, and you're going to be able to see that on a screen, whether it's your tablet or your phone or whatever you're doing it on. My issue with that is that, yes, you're going to have the moons. Of course, the moon's going to look pretty good. It's a bright object. I know there's a solar filter that you can put on the Seestar. So the sun, you're going to be able to look at the sunspots and things like that on our sun. There'll be one or two very bright objects which you'll get reasonable images out of. So whenever I look at images, it's usually the moon, the sun, the Orion Nebula, maybe the Carina Nebula. So very bright deep sky objects. And you can get reasonable, not too bad looking images out of that. Okay, so like I say, I personally would have issues recommending the Seestar to a beginner. I do accept that it's not a toy. I accept that you've got a triplet in there, you've got a little refractor in there, a 50mm refractor. But to me, its limitations are so much that I don't think that a person who is a beginner who purchases the Seestar, I don't think it'll take very long before they get bored of taking images of the moon, the sun, and a few brighter deep sky objects, and that they'll want to then move on, because they'll probably start looking at images in other places, like on the internet, and they'll start to wonder why they can't get images that look better than the ones that they're getting from a Seestar. And then on top of that, because you don't have the flexibility to just look at something with an eyepiece, then for me, if you're going to spend $900, then I actually think as a beginner you'd be much better off getting a visual telescope on a go-to mount with an eyepiece, right, which will cost you about the same sort of money, if not a little bit cheaper, and then even consider putting a little camera in there. Now, I know the counter argument to some of this is going to be, yeah, but now you get into the complexity of, you've got to understand how to use a go-to mount, and eventually maybe you've got to understand how to use capture software and these kind of things. So there's a lot obviously to factor in here, and just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, here is a little visual telescope. Okay, this is a SkyMax 127 visual telescope, and again, you can buy these as a package on a little go-to mount for around 1,200 Australian dollars. You can also get little Newtonian tubes which are cheaper than this, and they, I think, so let's have a look. We've got things like the Skywatcher Virtuoso, which is on a little Dobsonian mount. They're about $600-700. Like I said, this one would be about 1,200. And then you've got the Skywatcher AZ Go-To packs, and there's a bunch of those again which have different tubes on them, and again they can vary in price anywhere from about $600-700 up to like $1,200, that kind of things. But the reason I'm sort of saying this, the reason that I would advise actually getting a telescope and using your eyes, is because at this price point, I think that if I'm comparing taking images with the Seestar of the moon versus actually putting a telescope on the moon and looking at it with my own eye, then the eyepiece wins every time. Even people who do deep sky astrophotography, You know, I've taken a lot of images of the moon and processed them and stacked them, but nothing compares to actually looking at it yourself through an eyepiece. And of course, with that option, if you were to buy a beginner telescope, like something like a little Skywatcher Newtonian, a Maxitov, a little Celestron, there's various brands that sort of come as a package for around $1,000 or even a bit cheaper with a go-to mount. Sure, you've got to learn how to use the go-to mount. It's not that complicated, and there's a bunch of YouTube videos online. But again, you'll be able to put eyepieces in there and actually have a look at the object that you're looking at. And even if we're looking at things like the sun, because I know the Seestar comes with those solar filters, you can buy solar filters like this that go on the end of your telescope, and you can also look at the sun that way. So these are not, these little white light solar filters, they're not hugely expensive. You know, so you can also buy one of these for your telescope. So, you know, you can do that yourself. So I think these are important things to consider. So let's have a look down some of the things that I've put here. So the Seestar, the advantages here: hardware, software, applications, easy to use, and it's all in one package, and you're going to be controlling it from your phone, the whole thing. So you're going to be going to your object and you're going to be doing everything through your phone. The images will come back through your phone, it'll be stacking it on your phone. So I can certainly see the advantages there. But if we look at the other option, where we buy a separate telescope that comes with a mount bundled together, well, we can ourselves then buy a little camera like this one. So eventually we can put this camera where the eyepiece goes. So if I look at this telescope here, you know, only last week or the week before I was looking at the moon through this eyepiece, and then all I had to do was take this eyepiece out, which I can't quite do now because it's a bit stuck, but basically take this eyepiece out here. Let's see if we can manage to do this. I'll get it, I promise. Right, so that's the eyepiece, right? And then when I wanted to take some images of the moon, you know, I could put in my little planetary camera. Now, you know, this is a good way to start basic imaging. You can take some basic images of the moon. Again, if you had the proper filter, like a solar filter on the front of your scope, you could take some basic images, some solar images of our sun as well. And, you know, even on an alt-as mount, even on a little go-to mount, you could also point it to some of those bright objects like Carina, the Orion Nebula. And again, you know, you could take your own images then of those brighter deep sky objects. But the advantage is that you can also take that out and you can look at it yourself with your own eye. And I think at the moment, considering what I've seen of the images coming out of the Seestar, I think most people will get bored of that quite quickly, and it'll end up in a cupboard or a closet quite quickly. Whereas I think you'll get much more value for money out of buying yourself a little go-to package. And I'll try and flash one or two up on the screen for you, like the ones that we've mentioned, where you get a go-to mount and a small tube, something maybe around a 500-600mm Newtonian, or if you want to, it could be something like a small Maxitov. And the advantage is that later on now, if I decide that I do want to go into something like astrophotography, I can still use that camera and I can still use that telescope, and maybe all I do is I buy an equatorial mount. So again, I think there's advantages there in terms of an upgrade path. Whereas with the ZWO Seestar, everything's built into one integrated product. So what is the upgrade path there? Which I think leads to issues. I can see possible issues, you know, as you get more versions. I can see people possibly struggling to resell those Seestars. Now, on the other side of the coin, I do want to mention that, like I've said, astrophotography can be quite relatively complicated. But I think, again, you've got to remember that most of us enjoy or want some sort of a challenge, okay? So let's say, for example, my Seestar could take an absolutely amazing image. It could stack it and it could produce a brilliant image. And all I had to do was point and click and go to that target and just leave it running. I'd be interested to know how many people would actually want to do that long term, because what is the actual challenge in that after a while? If all I was doing was clicking on something and the next morning there was just an image waiting there, it starts to be, there's not enough challenge in it to actually keep you interested. So the challenges are around a normal, let's say, astrophotography setup. You've got things like polar alignment that you have to learn, how to polar align an equatorial mount. Plate solving, you often have to install some plate solving software. There's imaging software, so software like Nina or Sequence Generator Pro. So these are the actual pieces of software that are responsible for controlling everything, controlling your camera, controlling your mount, taking the images, downloading it onto your computer. You've got guiding to make sure that your images, you can image for a long time basically, okay? You've got stacking, so once you've got all your images, you then need to use a program on your computer to stack those images into a single file that you can work on to get a high quality image. Then you've got processing. Now there's a multitude of processing software out there, from free programs like Cyril to paid for programs like PixInsight and Photoshop. And then of course I've written at the bottom issues. So with standard astrophotography, there's always going to be, it's not uncommon to have some issues, whether it's a communication problem or maybe an issue with a cable or something like that. Now, most of the software that I'm talking about here, however, is free. So you can install it on your laptop. So most of the software that I'm talking about here is free, but there are those challenges. And of course, it's going to be a heavier rig. It's probably going to be a bigger rig overall for you to manage. But what I would say is I think those challenges and those overheads are worth it, because you're going to have the challenge and then you're basically going to learn these concepts along the way, and then you're going to produce an image that you're really happy with. So I think whilst we like to say things like this are easy and they're kind of one click, that's true, but most of us get bored if we don't have a challenge. And putting all these pieces together, this puzzle together of astrophotography, is a challenge, and that's often why people do it. All right, guys, so I think it is important to just present both sides here of the argument, because I feel personally like it's been a little bit one-sided towards the Seestar. And I think that there is an alternative. I think there's an alternative option here, which is the one that I've just been over, and is certainly what I would advise to beginners. Now, I know there's going to be people that disagree with me and think that this is a great option, or think that I'm misrepresenting it. Of course, there'll be people who think that, and that's fine. You're allowed to have those opinions, but we need to have multiple opinions out there. So I've been doing astrophotography for maybe 3 or 4 years now. And, whilst I know that people will say this is not for proper or whatever, astrophotography, they'll say it's electronically assisted astronomy. I just don't think it's a very good investment for a beginner at this stage, even as a way into the hobby. I actually think this is a much better way in, because you'll learn more, you'll have challenges, you'll get better images out of it, and there's an upgrade path as well. Now, is there a place for any of this stuff? I do think there actually is. Now, the Seestar, for example, is extremely portable, okay? It goes into a really small package. So I do think that there are cases like, it might be like a hiking trip, yeah? It might be, maybe you're taking one on holiday with you or something like that, where you can't carry the weight, outreach, that kind of stuff. So I do think there are certain applications for it. I will definitely say that. without a doubt, there's definitely going to be certain applications. But what I'm saying more is just for the beginner who's thinking about whether or not they should step into the hobby with a Seestar. At this stage, with where the technology is at the moment and the quality of the images and how long I think you'll stick with it, I still think you're better off going for what might be considered the harder option, because I actually think it will keep you, I think it'll be a good challenge, and I think it'll keep you interested. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. Not everything has to be a simple one click. And because often when something's that easy, you'll tend to just pass it on for the next thing. So I still think at this stage I would go for this option where you can enjoy some visual, you can still do a little bit of astrophotography, and you've got the upgrade path. So I'm sure there's going to be some interesting comments, so leave a comment down below, let me know what you think. And yeah, I hope that's maybe helped somebody out there, and good luck with whatever you go for, with whatever you choose to buy, whether it's the Seestar or whatever type of rig it is. And I'll see you on the next video. So cheers guys.